Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here with Onar, and this is going to be sort of a lengthy hangout. We'll try to stay purposeful. We're going to start off with this religion argument from design by statistics or likelihood or whatever, and then we'll just go from there. We're going to do some comments on the video. So let's start there. Onar, why don't you steelman the position of these mathematicians who have come out of the woodwork and say that Darwinism is not possible because there's just not enough time to do all the calculations, as it were. So we've got to have some helping hand.
Okay, let me first say that in one very narrow sense, they are correct. But it's a quite disingenuous and dishonest argument because they're attacking one particular thing that doesn't invalidate Darwinism, but invalidates a certain primitive version of Darwinism. And the primitive version that it invalidates is the notion of just pure accidental mutation. In other words, when you just get like a radioactive decay or something like that causes a replication error, something that's not so-called done on purpose. There's no mechanism behind it. It's just an error of replication.
Now,
and
ultimately, that does play some role. I mean, we see it as a true thing that there's a degeneration in DNA over time. But you're proposing other mechanisms such as sex, which accelerate this process.
But it doesn't just accelerate it. It optimizes it and makes it much more efficient and increases the probability of success dramatically.
So is it like an exponential version of?
No, it's not. I wouldn't say it's an exponential version. It's just that it's a far more likely version. So let's just start with steel manning their position. They calculate the possible ways of changing the code for producing a viable protein, and they measure the probability of randomly assembling, producing a DNA sequence which actually produces a viable protein, and it's just staggeringly low. Probability for that, well, 10 to the minus 77 or something like that.
That's a very disappointingly bad way for them to look at it. I mean, that's amazingly disappointing.
But it is a valid argument against the fact that this is not how Darwinism worked. That by it comes in some kind of accidental ray from cosmic rays or something and makes a replication error. That thing is not how evolution works. That part, they believed this 50 years ago, and they had to kill an awful lot of fruit flies and try to proving this by radiating fruit flies and hoping they will be producing mutations. And all they did was just produce a lot of dead and deformed and viable fruit flies. They never produced anything of interest from that way. So, and now we have the math to back up the intuition that came from that, which is that if you just put organisms into a radioactive chamber and mutate them over time, you're not going to produce anything that natural selection can work with. So, in that sense, they are correct.
Well, I'm asking you to stillman their position. Is that the best? That's the best they have. That these things couldn't. That it's unlikely that they could pop out of nowhere.
What they have, what the biology has more or less proven, is that the primitive version of Darwinism, which many biologists believed 50 years ago, something like that, namely that. You just need to put them into a radioactive chamber and out will pop out. If you give enough time, you will have some hopeful monster which can evolve through natural selection. We now know that this is not true. That primitive version of the Darwinian mechanism that was proposed by early biologists is false. That's not how biology works.
Certainly.
And they are correct about that, because if you look at the probabilities involved, it's just impossible for that mechanism to work. That part of the argument is true. What is disingenuous is the notion that now the alternative is intelligent design.
So a better version of what they're saying is to look at it the way we actually do look at it now. And when we want to create genetically modified organisms, we don't bombard them with radiation and hope something good comes out. We actually use genetic engineering now. So we look at genes as an actual fact, as something that we can deal with, rather than just looking at it as a random mess and who knows what's going to come about or how.
Yes, and but now we understand that we now understand that mutation itself has been naturally selected. In other words, mechanisms that are built into the body and stored genetically for how to mutate the DNA has been naturally selected.
Genes. That's what we discovered.
No, genes for creating mutations.
Genes, as in they're a package within the DNA. DNA isn't just a long strand of random numbers.
I know you're not getting what I'm saying.
Okay.
There are mechanisms for mutating DNA has been evolved through time.
Okay, well, the way our DNA mutates is in packages of genes, though, right? I mean...
Yeah. That's everyone agrees on that. That's not the point. But if you try to make just a random change to a gene, the odds of getting something useful out of that is very, very low. So low that it grinds evolution to a halt. Now, in the first 3 billion years of of life on Earth, there were not very efficient mutation mechanisms available. So for the first 3 billion years, nothing much interesting happened with life. But then when sex evolved around 1 billion years ago, then there was a mechanism for mutating DNA.
Now, what was first, sex or multicellular?
Sex.
Is that right?
Yes.
So multicellular life
probably wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for sex.
Yeah, very possibly not. Well, I can imagine the way I explained multicellular life to myself was there was a cell which divided, but then it stayed attached.
Now, we don't have to explain exactly how sex evolved. That's not the point. The point is, sex is a mutation machine. Right. It is something that produces variation, and so the mistake that is being made here, those who criticize this stuff, they're saying that if it's not a random mutation, then it has to be intelligent design. And that's false, because you can have a machine that is selected for over time that is very good at producing good mutations. And I'm going to give an example of that. I'm going to paste in a YouTube video in the chat, and you can show this to the audience. This is called a Galton Board, and anyone can see that this is it's a very simple device with a lattice of pins, and if you drop balls through this lattice of pins, they're going to be bouncing back and forth, so that when they land on the lower side of the pins, they're going to fall into a heap that is shaped like the normal distribution, the Gaussian distribution. And so here's an example of a completely 100% mechanistic, deterministic device. There's no intention here. There's no intelligence. There's no consciousness. There's no purpose, nothing like that. And yet it is able to take as input random from the environment and produce a specific kind of distribution, very structured a specific kind of distribution out of it. And it has, if you consider as a mutation as deviation from the norm, from the mean, then and success is defined as if the ball starts at the top and ends up in a slot at the bottom, somewhere in the bottom, that's a successful mutation. Then you will see that the success rate for this mutation mechanism is 99.999%. Almost all mutations are successful. Pretty much every single version of this is going to be successful. And
where we see that is the fact that sexual offspring are so frequently successful.
Yes, if someone has a baby, it's almost always a viable offspring. It might be having some kind of difficulty living. You have the normal distribution. Basically, sexual reproduction is like the Galton Board. It's doing basically the same thing. It's scrambling the genes in exactly the same way as the Galton Board. And it's doing so at a 99.9% or 99.99% efficiency. So almost all offspring are viable, but they might be in the unviable lower, like 10% of the normal distribution.
Yeah.
So those who are the lower 10% might be so badly adapted that they can't survive. So you have a normal distribution of IQ. If you have an IQ below like 50, something like that, which is part of the normal distribution, then you might not be very successful in life. But that's part of the mechanism. It just produces this normal distribution, and most of it is useful diversity. It has some at the edges, bad things happen. But usually there's the variation it produces around the center allows the whole population to move from over time, because you can select for those who are slightly above average or slightly below average, and then you can move in a specific direction across time. So this mechanism of the Galton Board is, in my opinion, a pretty good demonstration of what I mean by a completely mechanistic mechanism, no intentionality, no teleology involved at all, but it produces viable offspring.
Yeah. Now we can imagine, Richard Dawkins gave an example of this, but he says it's a teleological example, but you can just draw an analogy to nature. Like the thing about a monkey typing out on a keyboard the works of Shakespeare, right? Everybody talks about that, the likelihood of it. And He says, well, that's not likely, but what if you had a program that let the monkey type it all the way out, and when he was done, he goes back to the start, but this time he only fills in the letters that were wrong. So every once in a while where he got an S where there was actually an S in Shakespeare's works, that stays. How long would it take for the monkey to fill in Shakespeare's works? 1,000 iterations or something like that. 10,000 iterations maybe, but not 100 billion, trillion, quadrillion iterations. No way, no way. So if you have any sort of filter at all, anything that limits the outcome in this way or stops it going in that way, if you have any limitations, that's going to be like these little things in this Galton board that push them this way or that way. And so it's not just a blow your mind chance every single time. There is something somewhere, like with animals, it's the environment around them, and it stops certain things from being viable, and so only viable things work. So
it's a very good analogy. So imagine the monkey writing like some kind of sequence. Let's say, for instance, a sequence of just one, not sequence, just one letter. And that letter then falls through some kind of Galton board, something like that. But it's not a Galton board, but something equivalent to that, so that it's more likely that the letters are going to be arranged in a way that is that reflects the probability distribution of human speech, right? So you can tune the distribution of this so that the E is more likely to not be next to like an well, I don't know, like E has a certain likelihood of being next to another E, and so forth, and by having the chimp type randomly, and his letters falling through this kind of Galton Board like mechanism, it's not going to produce necessarily good words, but it might produce something that's far, far more likely than just his typing alone.
Yeah, and they're treating it then, to return to these mathematicians, they're treating it like the monkey has to type Shakespeare's works perfectly, randomly, starting from scratch every time.
Yeah.
That's their idea.
And another, there are many attacks on the current paradigm, and all those attacks are perfectly valid. One of the attacks is that DNA is perfectly compressed. It has maximum entropy. So they've done sequencing of, I think it's bacteria or something like that. And when they look at the information content of that bacteria in the DNA, it's so densely packed that it looks like it has been zipped, compressed, data compressed. And that implies that there's some kind of zipping mechanism, compression mechanism in the DNA. That's a perfectly valid argument, but that doesn't necessarily imply that there is an intelligent design behind it. It just means that there is some kind of mechanism that interacts with the genes to unpack it.
Now, somebody told me, and I thought you had told me, that that there was a good argument that DNA does not have any zipped stuff inside of it. And I wondered how that argument could be made, but this person assured me that's not the case. Maybe it's this guy Zeben64 who's on about this stuff.
Well, I don't know. I don't remember having that chat like you're talking about with you.
Yeah, it must have been somebody else. But
here's another example, and it's if you try to change something at a very fundamental level during the embryo phase, in the early stages of the embryo, that's almost always going to break the outcome. So basically what that means is that you have to make changes very late in the embryonic state in order for having a high probability of having a viable offspring. Now, how can this be compatible with the view of evolution? Well, as it turns out, you can think of it as a form of layering. It's that the way the embryonic phase works is that you grow up to a certain point, and then you add another new layer on top of that, where you make the changes very late in the embryonic stage, and now this becomes the new top layer. And later, some new top layer is going to be mutating on top of that again. So you can think of the embryo the embryonic phase as some sort of layering phase that keeps growing and growing, layer by layer, almost it's like geological deposits of new layers of change on top of it.
Now, first of all, it occurs to me that's why the embryo then looks the same across all species in early stages.
That's precisely it. In other words, they start out by looking the same because that's before the divergence of two lines. They share the first embryonic phase, then two lines separate with a different layering process, two species. But so they're similar up until the divergence point, and then they keep on growing. And of course, this will keep on branching. So you can find these similarities that they branch out. So what I'm suggesting is that I don't think anyone has actually done a job on this, and I think that this should be done. They should be mapping out the embryonic phase, the divergence, making a tree of comparison, similarity, just like they do with when they do morphological comparisons between species in grown states. They should do that for the embryo too. So they should compare one embryo at development stage with the embryonic state of another species and find when is it that they diverged, when is it that they look different. And they should do that for as many species as possible and try to do a morphological mapping of and see if this forms some kind of a tree structure. If this forms a tree structure, that more or less confirms just the mechanism I explained, that most of the change occurs very late in the embryonic stage, and it's just layering upon layering.
Googling it real quick, I find this from New England Complex System, Similarities of Embryos. Embryos of many different kinds of animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, etc., look very similar and are often difficult to tell them apart. Mammals,
yeah, sure.
Bird, fish, reptiles. So, I mean, it's being studied. People are...
But no, what I just said is different. This is like a genome project for embryos, basically. It's like it's like taxonomy. In the early taxonomers, the botanists, they created a taxonomy of biology, and in fact, it was these early botanists that laid the foundation for Darwin later to posit his theory of evolution. He used that tree, the tree of taxonomy between species, that was just categorized by botanists and by biologists. That was the foundation that he used, the empirical data, to posit a tree-like structure of life, a tree of life. Now, a similar taxonomy can be done for embryonic development. And I claim it will show the same thing.
Yeah, I wonder, because I've seen comparisons of it before. I wonder if they have not done that sort of detailed comparison. I wonder... see, there they are, the different items. Pretty similar, all different embryos. Now, what this gives us is evidence that once you have a stable structure, the best thing to do is to tweak it with very small variations. You start off with I was just saying, when you start off with a stable structure, and then you tweak it with very small variations after that, but the stable structure remains the same. And we have indeed a reptile brain in the center of our brain. And so it's easier to build one little new layer on top and see if that works out than to change the whole thing and rewrite the whole thing again every time. And so that's why we are identical in embryonic stage. As I'm showing, there's some pictures here I've got up on Google of various embryo things. Oh, you are no longer audible.
Oh, I can't see you in my video stream, by the way. Are you actually on?
Yeah, my little camera shows me showing up on Skype. You've not been able to see me this whole time?
I just realized that I didn't see you.
Oh, well, I've got two cameras on me recording me on my screens there.
That's not a problem. Then I'm sure it's okay. So if I wanted to steel man this argument, they have a lot of good arguments that the old naive model of just some random mutation coming from outer space producing some hopeful monster that is naturally selected, that's wrong. That's not how biology works. What is incredibly exciting is the notion that the mutation mechanism is actually a mechanism, and it's non-random, but it takes random from the environment as input, just like the Galton the Galton Board. The Galton Board takes random things. The balls are not entirely identical, and it takes that random and produces a bell curve. It structures the randomness in environments.
And we do see randomness in the entities that are born on Earth have to deal with the randomness of the events around them and what is produced by the other living entities around them. There's a certain amount of predictability to it and a certain amount of randomness to it. The predictability to it is ingrained deeply in our brain because people given certain drugs will have visions of snakes and trees even if they've never even been to a jungle. So there's something very, very deep in our brain, and these are preserved over time. And we only play with parts of it. We only add layers on and change little bits. We don't rewrite the whole thing. So we're just going to dismiss this whole new layer of arguments that are coming out as just, I mean, I do. I haven't heard anything useful yet. And our...
No. So the thing is, one of the reasons I'm very hard on this to say that evolution, when you say random mutation, that's just a shorthand. It's short code for some kind of advanced biological mechanism that scrambles things in the environment to produce something that has elements of randomness in it, but in a structured way. And it's like when people say climate change. We have to combat climate change. And a stupid counter argument is like that. Well, then we believe in climate change. So I'm not a skeptic. I believe climate change because nature is always changing. It's climate change. This is the most awful and annoying argument I hear from some skeptics. Because people who say climate change, they don't actually mean climate change. It's just a shorthand, instead of saying the mouthful of anthropogenic, catastrophic climate change. They don't want to say that all the time, so they shorten it to climate change. And that's okay. So therefore, I don't quibble with that. And anyone who quibbles with that is an idiot, because they're wasting time on something everyone understands. And the same thing is, when a biologist say that a natural selection acts on random mutations, that's a shorthand for saying acting on some kind of output which is partially random from a biological mechanism which is not random but which has been naturally selected for over a long period of time to produce a combination of random and non-random variation. That's an incredible mouthful to say. It's just easier to say random mutation. And just because you now say random mutation doesn't mean that you mean some kind of ray from outer space. That's not what it means. And it's an idiotic thing to say it. So when Zeeben64 complains about this, these neo-Darwinians, they're so bad and so wrong. No, there's very few people today who believe in this primitive version of this ray from outer space. Anyone who believes, a biologist who believes that today is basically outdated. He hasn't paid attention because we now know that that's not how things work. And that's what's called science. Science starts out by making a hypothesis about how evolution works. And then it turns out, it wasn't quite like that. We have to modify our beliefs. And so they do. But it's not like the basic mechanism itself is wrong. The basic mechanism is still absolutely as it should be. We're making new discoveries that life is far more interesting, evolution is far more interesting than we previously thought. But that's not the same as saying, intelligent design, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, so they're getting their panties in the bunch about the randomness. And the randomness really is not nearly as random as they think. That's what. Let me
give another example of a successful, very, very, very highly successful mutation mechanism which produces a bell curve. If you have, let's say, 10 dice, and you just throw the dice, and you sum up how many dice you have. You just take the number on each die, and you sum it up. So you get the sum of the numbers on the dice. Then you'll get a number between 12 and 10 dice. That's a number between 10 and 60. On average, it's going to be around 30. No, actually, it's going to be 35. 35, and it's going to be bell curved. It has to have a shape of a bell curve. If you take throw 10 dice and starts plotting these sum values, just like in the Galton board, you're going to get a normal distribution, and it's a highly successful mechanism because it's virtually certain that you're going to get a viable sum. When you throw 10 dice, almost always the dice are going so that you should have a face up, so that you actually can count the number of eyes visible, right? So the mechanism in this case is like 99.99999 certain to give a viable offspring. And that's exactly how things work in nature. You have some kind of mechanism that scrambles things in a structured way and produces an output that follows rules in such a way, like having a shape of a die, so that the probability of the die landing on the side, like on the edge, is very unlikely. It's like with a flip of a coin. There are people who have done tests about this. What is the likelihood that you're going to get neither heads nor tails? That's like 0.01% chance, something like that. It's very low probability. And like there's a math guy on YouTube who has actually done the experiment. He was very bored in the end, but he did an experiment with this. And the point is that this landing on the edge, when it's neither heads or tails, that would be an example of a failed mutation, right? That's like a sterile version. You don't produce a viable offspring. If it's a head or a tail, that's considered viable, right? So that's also an example of just the shape of the coin ensures that you're almost always going to get the right outcome. Now, if, however, this was not a coin but a ball, and you rolled it, the chances of it landing so that it showed head up would be much lower. Like it could fail then.
Now, nature, of course, would make it that way, because if you're going to have 1,000 offspring and you keep doing that iteration after iteration, you're not going to make 1,000 offspring where 990 of them are wrong. You're going to make 1,000 offspring where 990 of them are right. So you're going to have something like a coin, which lands either this way or this way.
Precisely. So imagine you have like a coin like that, and this is now the mechanism for mutation that has been evolved. So you flip a coin, you get either heads or tails, but it's oddly shaped in the beginning, so it doesn't look like a coin. It's almost round. Yeah. And that coin itself can then be arbitrarily, randomly changed a little bit in shape. Those shapes that are more likely to produce a binary output, either a heads or a tails, are then going to be selected for because they are very good mutation mechanism.
Male-female.
And over time, you're going to get a very, very good coin.
Male-female is the ultimate heads or tails.
Yep.
It's where you get one or the other, and one's very, very, very different from the other.
So, the steel manning only go so far. Like, they are right in their critiques of this primitive model that no one believes in. But that's a straw man argument. No one believes in that primitive form of Darwinism. Even if Zeben64 is very, very sure that everyone believes in that, it's not true. They don't believe in it. The sex has been known as a mutation mechanism for more than 100 years. Darwin wrote about sexual selection, right? So this has been known for an incredible long time. There's nothing new about this. So why someone is claiming this, I think it's just to make themselves more interesting, because then it sounds like they have a good argument when they really don't.
I think it might be to justify a move back towards religion.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the problem here, and I know for a fact that this is a reaction to materialism. I have talked to very, very intelligent and high-level scientists who have been incredibly negative to Darwinism for the same reason as Sieben-64, and has presented to me lots of evidence of things that does not fit with the old paradigm. And they have used this to say, oh, therefore there has to be some kind of intelligent design and so forth. And this is not in alignment with Darwinism. We have to throw out Darwinism. And I have been like whipping their asses like crazy, saying, you stupid guy, this is in complete, perfect alignment with Darwinism. No one has said that you have to believe in some kind of ray from outer space, that's how mutations occur. You can have consciousness playing a role in evolution. We know that sexual selection acts using consciousness as the selection mechanism, right? The female uses her consciousness to select which man gets to reproduce.
Right.
So consciousness already plays a role in evolution. So consciousness is part of the selection mechanism. Intelligence is part of the selection mechanism. Dogs were selected intelligently by humans, right? So intelligence can play a role in evolution, and it already has. Dogs is an example, and probably humans are an example, where humans were selected by intelligence. Like a smart woman selected a guy who was able to tell good jokes, and that's a proxy for intelligence. So, and he likes women who laughs at his jokes, because that's also a proxy for intelligence. So that's like an IQ test. And the man is a very good comedian, and those men who are able to tell good jokes are able to get the girls who like jokes. So that means you couple smart people with smart people, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a mechanism for sexual selection for intelligence.
Well,
And it involves intelligence, and it involves consciousness.
Humor is an IQ test. I really like that line.
But that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It should be on T-shirts. I mean, people ought to know that. It ought to be a saying like, we need a little chlorine in the gene pool, and by the way, humor is an IQ test.
Yeah.
A sense of humor is an IQ indicator.
Humor is an IQ test, and Epstein didn't kill himself.
Now, wait, if humor is an IQ test, that's why the left doesn't get any jokes.
Very nice one. Ka-ching. Yes. Intelligence can play a role. And here's a common argument that is used against intelligent design. And you use this yourself in your video on evolution, that it doesn't look planned. No designer would plan something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you give lots of good examples of that.
But it does look accidental.
Now, here's the thing, and it's a very good comeback. It's that what this proves is that there's no global, holistic design involved. But that doesn't exclude the possibility of local design.
What would be a local design? Give me an example. What do you mean?
Well, suppose that you are at a position in time, and you are trying to solve a solution there and then, and you have a choice of going this way or that way or like something like this, and which way should you go? Then the choice could be going in one direction. That can involve intelligence. So consider, for instance, many technologies like the QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard was originally designed for a completely different purpose. It was designed so that you put the keys that you use most often far away from each other. So when the hammers strike, they are less likely to get tangled up. If you put the keys that you use most often very close to each other, they will get tangled.
Yeah.
So So the QWERTY keyboard was trying to solve a mechanical problem. Now we still have the QWERTY keyboard, but its function is gone. It was designed intelligently to solve a local problem there and then for a local specific problem, which is they get tangled, these hammers. That problem is gone, but we're stuck with the QWERTY keyboard. And now someone could come along and say, this is proof that the QWERTY keyboard was not designed intelligently. There's no intelligent design there, because no intelligent designer would design a computer keyboard using QWERTY. Do you see?
Yeah. Well,
so you can say there was intelligence there locally and back in the 1880s, and that gets stuck in the system, and then it just keeps on living on in the system.
A purposeful stain. It's like a stain in the system that back in its time was very necessary and just stays there.
And what I'm saying is that the lack of total, complete cohesion of the system is only evidence of local design at most. In other words, there can't be any global design in nature, but there can be local design.
So where they find something that they think is a little spooky, we could say, yeah, well, chance would allow us to create that through
But it doesn't have to be chance. That's my point. It can be intelligence. It can be consciousness.
Which is also created by chance. I mean, ultimately.
It has been naturally selected for. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
So you're accumulating more and more survivability mechanisms, which then involves consciousness and intelligence. So what I'm saying is that in nature, there might be lots of consciousness involved, lots of intelligence, even at the cellular or DNA level, but it's not acting like one giant, huge overlord creator. And now I'm saying it doesn't have to be like that, but there's nothing in evolution or in science that says that it can't be like that. It's only those crazy people who doesn't believe in consciousness and free will, who believes that it cannot possibly be any form of consciousness involved in evolution. If you accept that consciousness is real and free will is real, there's no reason at all to believe that consciousness cannot play a role in evolution. I mean, it's just like a color or like a component of it. It's just like anything else. It can be selected for.
What if they're talking about things that are amazing chance-wise back in the days of single-celled amoeba, when everything was single-celled amoeba, and there's some amazing protein that was evolved back then that couldn't have been. There just wasn't time for it.
Well, that's a mystery. Like, we don't know how that, science doesn't provide answers to everything. We can just say that we've been able to use reductionism very successfully to reduce things to mechanisms. And it might be, here's my take on it. Reductionism doesn't necessarily hold all the way down. It might not be turtles all the way down, right? So, for instance, a reductionistic approach to the universe, I think I've given this example before, is like you look out into space, most of what you see is empty space. And then you make, like everywhere you just see a lot of empty space. 99.9999% of the universe is empty. And it's very tempting then to conclude that since most of what you observe is empty, then everything is empty. There's nothing in the universe. But we actually see stuff in the universe. It's very rare. We call it matter, but it's really important to us because we're made of it, right? And so therefore we conclude that even though most of the universe is empty, it's not completely empty. So reductionism only works down to a tiny residual. And the same argument goes with consciousness. Most of matter is unconscious that we know. We don't see any intelligence or consciousness in nature. But that doesn't mean that it goes all the way down. We are conscious, so we know that consciousness exists. And so it might be very, very rare, but it might still be very important in those rare instances, right?
Right.
So in the same way, it might turn out that you can use reductionism to explain 99.99% of evolution by simply random, like unconscious processes. But there might be like some kind of intelligence involved for some reason at certain instances in time that we can't exclude that possibility. And there's no reason to think that. Well, just because we observe 99.9% of the universe being mechanistic doesn't exclude the possibility of something non-mechanistic, because we are non-mechanistic. We have a free will, right? So what actually happened in the early stages, we can't say for sure. It's very likely that there is a mechanistic explanation for it. But, okay, so what if it's not?
Well, they want to have an intelligent designer come and take care of it. But
even if they do get that, if you grant them that first amoeba involves some intelligent design that we can't explain by mechanistic forces, so what? Most of evolution can still be explained by mechanistic forces.
And it
doesn't just because it involved intelligence doesn't mean it involved a grand creator who's like an almighty creator or something like that.
Yeah, that's where I would go. I would say, how do you jump from you haven't explained X to there must be a creator? How do you jump from that? I mean, you haven't explained how some protein evolved at some point in time before the likelihood of it was possible according to your theory of likelihood. How do you jump from that to there must be a creator? That's just, if that's their argument, that is the worst argument I've heard this week.
Well, I do have some sympathy for it because, I mean, we use a similar argument when we argue for free will. Just because most of what we observe around us is not conscious and not free. We are free, and we have direct observation of that. And therefore we know that it's real. It might be rare, but it's real. And similarly, we observe creation all the time. We observe intelligence all the time. So we know that intelligence is real. So I'm sympathetic that they take this and they say, most of what we see in nature doesn't produce anything that's structured. And if you see something that's highly organized, it's usually intelligence involved because that was what we see around us.
Well, what about things like beaches with stratified layers of rock, sand dunes with ripples? I mean, that's like, there's no intelligence involved at all there, and it's very organized. It goes on for thousands of miles in exactly the same pattern. So it seems like organization is just part of our universe. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Look at the way the planets go around the sun. That's organized. That's very organized.
But you never see a car, right?
You never see
floating
a car
on the beach.
Right. True. Right. You never find a watch on the beach. But there's organization everywhere in nature, in random nature, like in the ripples on sand dunes. That has to be called an organization.
It has to be called an organization, but not a machine.
Right, true, but organization then is a metaphysical fact that is everywhere.
But we are, in one sense, biological machines.
Well, we are similar to the solar system in the way that we're not permanent. No. We break down over time, and the solar system will break down over time.
But the solar system is not a machine. We are actually a machine.
Well, we're a more complicated version of it.
No. We're fundamentally different. Fundamentally different from the solar system.
We reproduce ourselves. That's important.
Not just only that we reproduce ourselves. We're self-organizing, self-healing, and the system of processes in our body work in a machine-like interconnected manner.
Well,
we are a machine.
I'm thinking of the resonance between the orbits as being something that's quite highly specialized. And in that sense, we do break down over time. Our cells degrade.
Yeah, but it's not comparable.
We age.
Like if you tell this to a creationist or someone who believes in creation, all that what you just mentioned is not going to impress them. And I have to say I understand why. Because the kind of machine-like organization you see in biology Like, have you seen those kind of these animations of DNA thing where they have made the mechanisms, they have simulated the mechanisms of DNA of these walkers, things that walk on DNA and all that. That's absolutely insane. It looks like that. That's not anything like what you're talking about, beaches, ripples in the sand. And what they see is that when they see that kind of organization, they see something that is fundamentally different. And I understand why they say that. Because, I mean, if you pretend that ripples in the sand can be compared to anything that goes on inside of a biological machine, then you're just not talking to the right audience. Because they're just going to wave that off and say, ripples in the sand are not as impressive as a biological machine. And I have to agree.
Yeah, well, philosophically, we can just posit as philosophers that organizations, we get the concept of organization from the universe. That's where we get the concept.
But we can still categorize things into different kinds of order. So, for instance, we categorize the world into empty space and matter, right? Most of the world is empty. So that's like the rule of the universe is that emptiness is the norm. But matter is different. So we recognize that it's fundamentally different, and therefore we treat matter as something that's not the same as emptiness. Similarly, we recognize that living material, organisms, is fundamentally different from everything else in the universe.
All right, so how now? Maybe the only way out of this is to get them to draw parallels between life and the rest of the universe, and realize that life is part of the universe and not fundamentally different, because it's not. It's just a detail of the universe.
Oh, but not like I understand that. It's I don't know what you mean by not fundamentally different. It is fundamentally different from a planet or a moon.
It's not fundamentally different from the universe. It's not set apart from the universe.
What do you mean by that? I don't understand that.
Well, you can find incredibly organized things everywhere, and life is
not machines.
Well, you can find layers in what we call a life machine. It's just layers of organization. It's
not the same.
Well,
and a biologist can back me up on this.
I'm not. It's just an analogy I'm drawing. The layers get piled on over time, and this particular thing has been layering on for about 3.2 billion years. That's a long time to. I mean, something.
I understand. I understand the accumulation of order. That's very nice, but still, you're not going to make any headway with that argument. And I think it's better to embrace the fact that life is very different from everything else in the universe.
Okay, well, if we grant them that there's the universe and then there's life.
No, and we were obviously part of the universe, but like the rest of the universe, dead matter behaves very differently from living matter.
Well, we might learn a lot by drawing conclusions as to how it's not actually very different, but like
no, we do have a lot of things in common. I mean, gravity acts on us.
Well,
we're not immune to the physical forces of reality.
Well, like Richard Dawkins was talking about the way that the surface of clay organizes the clay that lands on it, and crystals snap into organizing grids, and how that is a proto-form of life. It's changing everything around you into your form as much as you can.
I agree that something similar to that is going on in life. And at some point in the future, we're going to have a science of life. In fact, I'm working very much on that. If you would like to indulge me, I can give a little rant on that.
Please do. Mention viruses, though.
No, no.
Because what is life? If a virus is life, that's interesting. But anyways, so the science of life.
The science of life. It started out with Ilya Prigogine. He was a chemist who won the Nobel Prize for self-organizing behavior, and he called it dissipative structures. And so if you add energy to an entropic system, and push it far from equilibrium, it's going to start self-organizing. It's going to start bouncing off structure in the surroundings, and that structure is going to cause standing waves that self-organizes the system.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can find an example of that. What's it called? Convection cell. I forget what this. Oh, there we are. I think I found one. So this is one of the most famous examples from Ilya Prigogine. I forget what it's called now, but it's a convection cell. You're heating. You have a glass plate that's coal on top, and you're liquid in between, and then you heat it from below.
And it just forms into those cells naturally.
Yes.
Now those look an awful lot like living cells.
Yes, and this is like the basic primitive building block. And in fact, what you will get, in this case, you have a completely flat and nice, clean surface, like a glass surface. But what if you had instead not a clean surface, but a bumpy surface, both on top and on bottom? How would that affect these cells?
Is there another example?
Yes, I will show you.
I'm looking at the Rayleigh-Bernard convection cells.
Yeah, that's the Bernard's.
Is that the one you're thinking of?
Bernard's that's what you're saying. The Bernard cell. That I forget. I'm trying to find an example of what I'm looking for. It's very annoying that I can't find what I'm looking for. Extremely annoying, in fact. Oh, here I think I found something, but it's not a very good example. But it gives sort of like an example. It's clouds. You see it from above, and it's when you look at clouds from above, and it's really annoying me that they can't show pictures of clouds from above. They're just showing it from the side. How annoying is that? Because if you look at it from above, you'll see some fractal Bernard cell-like structure.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So clouds are fractal in nature, and they are like these Bernard cell convection cells, but they don't go up into nice rational numbers, whole numbers. They are irrational numbers, so that you get this fractal pattern. Repetitions on many different scales.
All right. Now, this is life science you're proposing.
Yes. Now, okay. Let me continue. The point here is that what a dissipative structure does, it sucks out order from the environment.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Now, where has that come from? Do you know an origin of that? Because I've been using that. Oh, no, I definitely heard it from somewhere. Life is a vacuum that sucks other pieces of order up and uses them.
Well, actually, I don't know where I've heard it. I think that's something that I've been saying for a long time, too. Like, I haven't actually heard that from somewhere. What I'm saying is that the dissipative structure, when people talk about self-organization, and I hear this all the time, that they say, oh, look at this self-organization. It completely misses the point. A structure like the Bernard cell is not self-organizing. It's structured from the outside. It is the glass plate on top of the cell that creates the cells. So what the cell does is that it bounces with this highly structured plate on top and on the bottom. And when it has this very, very structured cell, the plate, in which that can structure it. It sucks out the order out of that plate and produces those very nice cells. If you introduce impurities into the plate, then you're going to get also impurities in the Bernard cells. So let me see if I can find an example of that.
I'm watching the Rayleigh-Bernard thermal convection 3D simulation.
Oh, that's cool.
I wonder if it's as good as the real thing.
Yeah.
Well, so this is evidence of order in the universe.
Yes, and this is an example of a system that where you put energy into it, it will become a process. The Bernard cell is not a thing. It's not an object. Those cells you see, they are not an object. They are a very fleeting thing. They are by definition what we can call a process, an energetic process.
Which can be disrupted. All you have to do is stop the flow of energy, remove the plate, or whatever.
Now, what is the definition of a process? It is a system in which energy and matter flows through it.
Well, life seems to be a process.
Yes, it's not an object. It's a process. So a river is a process. A river is not an object. It's actually, there's energy in the form of moving water, and there's of course water molecules. So energy and matter is flowing through the river system. That is the river. It's the flow, right? So it's a process. The same is true with a fire. A fire is a process because it continually has energy and matter flowing through it.
Yes,
right?
It's not a static object.
So if you see a flame, you're tempted to say that's an object. It's a flame object, but it's not. It's a process. And it has some kind of fleeting existence. It is a kind of object, semi-like object, but it doesn't have the properties of a rock. A rock has elements and it stays the same. It's static. It's frozen. Whereas a flame looks like an object, but is in fact a process. It's not a real thing. And the Bernard cell is also an example of a process, but it's contained in an object. So the walls around it is what it uses to suck order out of. And another very famous example of order sucked out of the environment is an organ pipe. You get a standing wave when you blow moving air through an organ pipe, it will produce a sound, right? And that has a standing wave inside of an organ pipe. That is a self-organizing system within that organ pipe. And the frequency of that sound is 100% determined by the length of the pipe. So it's being struck by the pipe. So that air is sucking out order from the pipe and producing a structured sound with a specific frequency which reflects the length of that pipe, right?
Right.
So that's a dissipative structure, and we have all sorts of examples of this. Now, here is what you need to do in order to get life. What if you were able to have another dissipative structure that acts like the wall of a second dissipative structure? So they both are each other's walls. It's a closed process. It's like the snake biting itself in the tail. So if the plate on the Bernard cell was produced by the Bernard cells, and the Bernard cells was produced by the plate. So both of them produce each other. So it's organizationally closed. Then that organizational closure is actually what is producing the order, not structure from the outside. Now it is actually, by biting itself in the tail, generating intrinsic order. The system itself is producing its own order. Now, that is what you need in order to have a living organism.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I'm looking for the video now, but there's a video on the thermal vents in early Earth and the chemical reactions that he said were caused by these surfaces with hydrogen going up one side of the surface, and that the free hydrogen from a thermal vent allowed these chemical reactions that were very important for the very first stuff. Have you heard this stuff? It was really good, and I can't find it now. I shared it. I put it on Facebook. I tried to spread it around so everybody in my circle had access to it. But have you heard about that?
I've heard about something similar, but at the moment, I'm not really interested in specific mechanisms of the beginning of life. But what I can say is that what you just described here is an example of a dissipative structure, not a living structure.
Well,
where
yeah.
you have order. Listen to me. You have order in the environment. It's structuring something that happens from the outside. So it's not part of the living organism. It's structuring the organism. And that is ultimately how life has to start. It has to be structured from the outside. It can't structure itself when it doesn't exist. So it starts out as a dissipative structure, which is leeching off order in its environment. But at some point in that stream of order from the environment, it is able to bite itself in the tail so that it can move away from the stream, so that it can continue its organization without that stream from the environment.
Yeah, and when does it do that? It's when it's able to reproduce itself.
Oh, no, not necessarily. No, not necessarily. Reproduction probably came very early as a mutation mechanism. And the reason you need a reproduction for a mutation mechanism is because it's not a stable process. So you need to generate diversity. You need to produce lots of things that natural selection can act on. So reproduction was probably one of the first mutation mechanisms that evolved.
Well,
in fact,
it seems like it's the source of mutation.
Yeah, not only that, but it is like it's the primary mutation mechanism that is reproduction.
Yeah,
people don't think about it like that, but that's actually what it is. The only reason we need reproduction is in order to produce mutations. That's why it's been selected for.
Yeah, well, that's how I think of it. I think of life as things that reproduce themselves.
Now, here's the thing. You don't necessarily need to have reproduction for life, but in practice, it's so unlikely to have a living organism that is viable if you don't have reproduction. So reproduction is probably the only way that you can have sufficiently viable systems or living beings.
Well,
that's the only mechanism for producing viable offspring.
I would just challenge you and say that life is defined as a thing which reproduces itself. You couldn't have a living thing that...
No. In practice, you couldn't have it, but you have to distinguish between an incredibly important mutation mechanism, learning mechanism for creating life, for long-term viability, and the organism itself.
Well, true.
So reproduction is not the same as a living. You can have reproducing things that are not alive.
Well, what you said earlier was it's a process, not a thing. But that's
okay, but give me a bone here.
No, I definitely don't. I definitely think life is reproduction. But there's a difference between something that reproduces itself exactly like the surface of a crystal and life, which produces itself almost exactly. nearly
No,
exactly.
but that's actually a very good example. A crystal does some form of reproduction, but it's not alive. So reproduction is probably necessary for very, very long-term viability. But it's so in practice, it is part of the definition of life. So it's an unavoidable part of the definition of being alive. However, you can have a living organism that doesn't reproduce. It's just not going to be viable in the very, very long run. Like you can have sterile offsprings and they're alive, right?
Oh yeah, sure, but we call them sterile.
We call them objectivists. or oblectivists.
I have one offspring.
Oblectivists, I mean.
Yeah. All right. Well, would you care to submit a definition for life?
Yes, it's a self-producing dissipative structure, and with where the dissipative structure has organizational closure. And by organizational closure, I mean that the dissipative structure has causally linked with itself, so it produces the boundary that it needs in order to structure itself.
A self-reproducing?
No. Reproduction is a secondary part of what it means of being alive.
What does it mean to self-produce?
A body, you self-produce every day, even though you don't reproduce. If someone makes a cut, if you make a cut in your hand, it will heal.
Self-healing? Self-producing?
Yes. So parts of you die all the time. You are just 1 second away from starting to rot. Like the instant you die, you start decomposing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, your gut.
And you have to continuously fight that, and that is done by self-production, not by self-reproduction. So the thing that connects you from 1 second to the other is not reproduction, but production, self-production. And there's even a theory about it, autopoiesis, which means self-production. It was a theory coined by Maturana and Varela, two Chilean biologists in the late 60s and early 70s. And they are essentially correct, but like Ayn Rand gave the definition of life, the correct definition of life, 30 years earlier. So
self-sustaining and self-generated action.
That's right. Self-sustaining and self-generating means producing, right? Generating action. And action means not just a process, but an objectified process. And it's only a thing that can act. So you need to have an identity in order to be able to act. So so action means that it has organizational closure. Organizational closure means that A acts so that it keeps on being A.
Well,
the definition of biology is then self-generating action. It is a thing in the one moment, and it uses its thingness in that moment to produce itself in the next moment. That is part of the definition and identity of a living being.
So I submit the definition of life as a self-reproducing entity that has a mechanism for differences in generations.
Well, I will just have to disagree. Because self-reproduction is an important part of it, just like breathing is an important part, but not all organisms breathe.
Well, all organisms reproduce.
No, they don't.
They have a mechanism for it.
Yes, they do have a mechanism, but they don't reproduce.
Our ancestors all reproduced.
No, not all of them.
Au contraire. I mean, they wouldn't be our ancestors otherwise.
I will give you an example. the worker ants in a ant colony. They're sterile.
True, but it's not their genes.
They don't reproduce.
Their genes do not pass on. Oh, but you're saying they're alive.
But they're alive.
Okay, but as a life form, they do participate in reproduction by protecting the queen.
That's true. They have outsourced the reproduction to the queen.
I don't look at the ants as individuals. I look at them in a colony.
Well, you should partially look at them as individuals.
No, they're collectivist bastards. I know those bastards.
Yeah, they're communists.
They're commies down to the core. I know those bastards.
Yeah,
I saw the movie. I know.
That's true. But so reproduction is an incredibly important part of life. And it's so important that I can say with great certainty that life would probably, like 99.9999% certainly not have existed without reproduction. So it is such an important process that we can't really think of life without it. But on a day-to-day basis, it is not self-reproduction that defines a living organism.
I wonder.
Self-reproduction defines life as a continuous process across vast spans of time, but not in the moment. That is self-production.
Okay, well, let's look at a 40-year-old man with no children versus me, and my day versus his day, and I might have a more meaningful day because I have offspring.
Oh, I'm not challenging you on that. Absolutely. I'm not trying to diss self-reproduction. We've been talking a lot about self-reproduction, of how important that is, and it's an important part of life.
Essential.
It is. I would also say that it is an essential part of life, because you wouldn't exist without it. So the way life is now, reproduction has become an inescapable part of what it means to be alive.
Yes.
But nevertheless, reproduction defines an aspect of life that is not part of each individual organism, but what is the long chain of life across from passing from one organism to another.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of thing. It's that thing that connects one generation to the next generation of organism. But each organism in itself can live without reproduction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, for sure.
So when you're defining an organism, you're first and foremost talking about self-production. But when you're talking about the long chain of life, which is part of our existence, and it's an incredibly important part of it, and we should really include it in our thinking of what it means to be alive, then self-reproduction becomes absolutely essential.
All right. Well, shall we draw a line?
Okay.
On that subject.
Okay. Fine.
I mean, I don't know where else to go from it. But we were meant to cover the mathematical people, and we're off on the metaphysical definition of life at this point.
No. But the point here is that, like this. Let me bring that back into that discussion again. Okay. What I just did here now is I've started sketching out what it means with a true metaphysically sound definition and science of life.
Yeah.
This is not a materialist version of life. It starts with information. It starts with organization, right? So it doesn't start at all with one blob of matter. It starts has a different foundation.
Yeah.
So an organism is a fundamentally different metaphysical object from just any other object. It's in fact not an object. It is a process. It's an objectified process. It's a process that spends all its time pretending it's an object, making itself into an object.
I like that. It's a process that pretends it's an object. I'm going to submit that as one of the definitions. A process that pretends.
So pretend. It's a little bit a sloppy definition because pretend means you have to have an imagination and so forth. But I like it as like a shorthand definition.
Now, if we took that seriously, it's a process that thinks it's an object, then
Oh, it just thinks.
Then you really ought to have kids. Of course. A person ought to have kids because you're not an object. You're part of a longer chain.
Yep.
If we took that definition seriously, it would have real implications.
Absolutely. So it's not just like a fancy way of saying things. It has real content, and that's what I'm saying. Why it has proper and a sound metaphysical foundation. And I think that what I just did now is outline something that lots of people who are skeptical of secular ways of thinking, this is something that they easily could come aboard with. Most religionists would have no problems with what I'm just outlining here. Right? Because this opens up for all sorts of things that it doesn't necessarily exclude the notion of a soul. It doesn't exclude consciousness. It doesn't exclude intelligence and so forth. All of these things can mix and match in a nice big process of things. And so the secular people will have their part of it that they like, and the religions will find things in here that is compatible with their outlook on life. So what I'm saying is once we start embracing consciousness, intelligence, the creative nature of life, all of these things, and put them into a proper theoretical framework, that is something that is appealing to people who normally are hostile to biology because they think it implies materialism.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was distracted because your video link just clicked up on the screen for some reason.
Oh, okay.
You didn't
what
send
I'm saying,
it just then. Okay,
let me repeat that last sentence.
Yeah.
Is that what I just sketched here is something that gives a bone to the people who are very skeptical of materialism.
Okay. Yeah.
This is a non-materialistic approach to life, to biology.
Your definition of it as a process?
Yeah.
How is it non-materialistic?
Because it involves information. Information is a key aspect of what it means to be alive. Because an organization doesn't consist of any particular atom. It's the organization is the particular structuring of that, and that's an information thing.
Yeah, but isn't information a mechanistic part of the universe?
Well, now we open up for instance, consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Consciousness lives on information.
Yeah, and consciousness doesn't seem as I don't know, as free as people want to when they say we have free will. Sort of, you have to go to sleep at night and get up in the morning, and the day repeats itself, and you sort of eat 3 times a day, whether you have free will or not. You have to eat, and so there's free will's in a little teeny tiny pocket. We only have certain things we can decide about.
Yeah.
I hope that applies to what you said. Now we're in such abstract territory.
That's true, but I just wanted to bring this out so that to show that there is a path away from all this materialist garbage, but you don't necessarily have to go down a religious rabbit hole.
Okay, when you say you're giving a bone to the people who are questioning materialism, what exactly do you mean by that? Flesh that out a little more.
Well, once you have something that is a process, it involves information. It doesn't involve necessarily just things bumping into each other, but it has. When you have organization, you have something greater. You have whole holistic systems, right? And our mind is a holistic system as part of that, right? So it can involve consciousness. It can involve intelligence. It can involve lots of things that they think that should be in there. And for instance, how do you explain the machine-like nature of an organism? Well, this is the life science that explains that, and it can have consciousness and it can have intelligence as integrated parts of that, because dissipated structures are the building blocks of intelligence.
Now,
They are able to heal themselves, and that's a form of intelligence.
Are lives like machines, or are machines like lives?
Machines are like life.
Yeah.
Machines are a copy. It's a straw man, a stick figure copy.
It's a frozen entity.
It's a frozen entity, but it's trying to emulate the organization of life without the process.
Yeah, what's interesting is it goes through us for the process, like the V8 engine that came from the 4-cylinder engine, that came from the 2-cylinder, that came from the 1-cylinder engine. It goes through us. But it changes, it mutates over time, but not by
intelligence.
With intelligence involved, not by self-reproducing. Yep. So it's a frozen analogy of life.
Yep, that's precisely it. And the thing is, what we're doing now when we're making a machine, all the industrial revolution era, everything up until now, is like a little child when they want to draw a human that they're making a stick figure. It doesn't actually look like a human, but you can see it's a sketch. It's an outline of something that might be a human. We recognize the stick figure as a human, very primitive. And what we're doing now when we're making machines is that we're making something that is a stick figure version of an organism.
Complex machines.
Yes. So a machine has many things in common with biology. It's largely an imitation of things in nature, because in nature, in biology, you have this mechanical organization in the form of machinery, interlocking of parts making into a whole, functioning whole. And that is what we are emulating, but without the process, without the self-organization built into it. We are replacing self-organization with our intelligence. We're using our intelligence to emulate what nature does with dissipative structures and self-organization.
Yeah, but it misses only reproduction to be alive. They're very complex, they're purposeful, but if they could cause their own iterations of themselves, then they would be alive. No, they'd have to be purposeful. No, it is a very restricted analogy to life.
And they would not be alive even if we would allow them to reproduce. They would still not be alive.
Yeah.
Because they're still just mirror images of our imagination.
Yeah. Like if we built some sort of robot that went to the moon and reproduced itself, I don't know. At what point would we call it life if it was self-reproducing?
No. It could become alive. We could be those vents in 4 billion, like those vents 4 billion years ago.
Yeah, the origin,
and then new kind of life form spawns from that. That's perfectly possible.
Yeah.
But now that we're into like sort of speculative territory. But that's okay.
All right. So let's draw a line on the life discussion and what creationism.
Yeah.
Let me go see if there were questions that we haven't covered in the religion and sexual perversion video.
Okay.
Let's see. Mr. Janko. This was interesting. I thought of something similar to this, but wasn't convinced at the time. Realizing now who or where defenses of these practice are lectured from and who actually practices them while ignoring the reason not to practice them made me think of the mind-body dichotomy. So, returning now briefly to the thesis of what we had talked about before with the religion and sexual perversion, that when you tamp down the mind, it's the genitals are what's left, and he, instead of mind genitals, he says mind body, and of course in objectivism that's a very good way to understand things, the mind body dichotomy philosophically.
Yeah, I like that. Like the body is the flesh, right? And flesh is usually often used as a metaphor for sexuality, right?
Yeah,
the urges of the flesh.
And so for him, for Rand, there is this view of the people who want to control the mind and the people who want to control the body. And like the Republicans want to control your morals and the Democrats want your pocketbook. The Democrats will let you turn into a tranny and sleep with children. They don't care, just as long as they can tax you at 100%. The Republicans want to lower your taxes, but they don't want you being perverted with children at schools, and they think you should be polite to your neighbors and not swear in public and mow your lawn. They might even have an ordinance that you have to mow your lawn.
Generally speaking, like if there were no people on the left in society, only conservatives, society would be quite okay. Like there wouldn't be crime and like there wouldn't be any social issues or problems, most likely. But it would be very boring and not very adapting.
Yeah, I mean, I know it would be a little boring, but I would rather have a lot of Christopher Hitchens's and George Orwell's, because that would be the entertainment in a conservative society, and Mark Twain.
That's true, but let's...
Instead of asshats like the donkey people who get in shopping carts and roll out into streets in front of cars.
Just to sort of pick up on the evolution part of it again, like evolution has selected for a society in where you have people who are conservative on one part of the bell curve and people who are liberal on the other part of the curve.
It's true,
and it's because you can think of the liberals as mutations, but in this case they're mostly harmful. But every so often they produce something of value. And that makes up for all the bad stuff they bring with them, like crime and rape and murder and all that.
I guess it makes up for it. But you're right. Society has evolved in a way that this is more stable than everybody being conservative or everybody being liberal. There's no way everybody could be liberal.
Just to summarize it up, for every Shakespeare in society, you probably are going to have to endure 100 Harvey Weinsteins.
Yikes. That's a bad ratio, but yeah, we probably have to take it.
So it's the same kind of biology behind Shakespeare because he's a creative dude. But the problem is that kind of creativity makes also creativity with the law. So you produce a lot of criminals in that way. So, but it's worth it for society as a whole, with all these sexual perverts and criminals and murderers and rapists, for that Shakespeare or that Einstein that emerges every now and then. Right. Now, what I would argue is that just because Einstein is really necessary to bring society forward, as is Shakespeare and the like, I would still argue that we don't have to accept all the murders. We can still get the benefits of Einstein without having to have too many Harvey Weinsteins. So what I'm saying is that we should try to select for the mutation mechanism in society so that it produces maximum amount of good mutations, like maximize the amount of Einsteins and minimize the amount of Harvey Weinsteins.
Now, I want to add a teeny grain of existentialist philosophy to that and say that we reproduce ourselves every day. And I want to speed evolution up, and I want to see if we could get rid of Harvey Weinstein's, sort of socially, but without having to wipe out the whole human race and move forward 100 years. And it seems like we sort of have, like the 50s and 60s are different from the 80s, or different from the 2000s, even though a lot of the same people are still around. Society changes even though a lot of the same people are still here. And to some extent it doesn't change. I know the old people have to die before we can move on. That's true, right?
And even if they die, history repeats. right?
Yeah, that's the thing the youngsters don't understand. Let's get rid of the old people and we can move on, and you can move on to repeating the cycle.
Yeah, so let's get rid of all those bad people so that we can become communists again once more.
And then communism will collapse and then start over.
And then they create the Roman Empire again that collapses.
Yeah. Now, I wonder, well, we'll see what the future of America holds. Well, I wonder if it's a dynamic system we've created that'll be more stable in the long run than... I wonder if in the past we created machines and now we've created a life form.
That's interesting. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, the Roman Empire was a machine and it was a static thing that broke down. But the American version is a life form that can recreate itself and evolve. And it has spread. It's taken over Germany. It's taken over Japan. It's taken over large swathes of the earth.
I can certainly agree. Like, I don't want to abuse the analogy of a life form too much, but I can certainly agree that it is a more dynamic version than the Roman Empire. But on the other hand, the Roman Empire, look at how successful the Roman Empire was in reproducing itself. Like, it spread Roman law to large parts of the known world, including Germany and England and all the Christian nations or so forth. Roman law was important.
Let me put Rome to the side for a second and draw a more recent analogy between Britain and America. Britain was like cancer that spread out, and America is like a life form that reproduces itself. It doesn't have to reach over there and be part of that thing. It just sends one of its children over there. So America now has 50 copies, where Britain had one copy that was over the whole planet. Britain was like cancer. America is like life forms. Spiders. America has sent out 1 million spiders instead of one large web from one big spider.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Yeah. I like that.
I wonder, therefore, if the American thing might be like if societies are evolving, the state came into existence at some point, and then the state evolves. Have we reached a point where the state can evolve sort of almost constantly?
Yeah, I think so. Like, what we've seen in nature is that nature has no respect for things that already exist. It will make room for new things whenever it can. So consider, for instance, ants. One way of thinking of ants is that they are being trapped as slaves to the ant colony, slaves to the queen, and that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is just that this new organization just happened to co-evolve with ants, and the individual soldier, it doesn't really care that it's that it's part of something greater. It doesn't it can coexist. So the ant colony takes on an existence of its own, just like we are made out of cells. The cell has no concept of us. It just does what it does, and it maybe it's just very happy doing whatever it does. But we sort of enslave our own cells to produce our own large-scale life. And it could be that states are going in that direction, that states are evolving into some sort of deep state that just reproduces itself and makes people in the state sufficiently happy that they're not complaining about it reproducing itself.
Well, that last bit there about the deep state took a bit of a turn. That's scary. I mean, I was nodding my head, and then I nodded my head more solemnly, because what if that is the stable structure, is some sort of deep state that society is like on puppet strings, but it's the most stable thing because most people are happy, and so it reproduces itself.
That's why I mentioned it, is because it doesn't need to have a happy ending, right?
Yeah, it just has to be stable.
Yep, because in nature doesn't care about your existence, if there's something better coming along or something more adapted coming along, then okay, sorry, Mac.
Yeah, if you can't defend your territory, you're out.
Yep.
Well, I looked through the other comments on this video. I think that's all we needed on that video, on those comments. Now, you and I were having a little go back and forth about religion. Let's see.
Yeah.
Can you recall my thesis, or should I pull up the comment thread there?
Just do it. You remember it better than I.
Let's see. Thesis. Humans have moved past the religion paradigm. No historical analogy with religion will serve future societies. Nietzsche was right. God is dead. And by that I have the idea that now that science is sort of out of the bag and has been for 500 years, and now we've got the internet and the ability to find knowledge about things. We're not in a dark age of knowledge anymore. Religion has been not particularly important for philosophers and scientists for hundreds of years, and it's just going to soak further and further down into society. It's going to be less and less important on a daily life for people to explain things and get along and have a healthy emotional reaction to the universe. It's going to be less and less important.
I think that is completely unrealistic.
It seems to be. I'm just observing our society, though.
No, like look at environmentalism, Marxism, all of these things that are emerging. These are new religious cults, right? And they're emerging precisely because of secularism, right? Materialism.
Marxism, yeah. Materialism, yeah. Yeah. Look, the failure of the Renaissance is not the fault of the Renaissance. It's the fault of Marxism. Well, maybe we can blame it on the Renaissance.
What I would blame it on is that when you're trying out something new for the first time, you're almost always going to fail. And most new mutations are bad, right? So whenever you're in creative territory, trying out something radical and new, it's almost always bad or has some bad side effects.
Yeah.
And therefore, when Enlightenment came along, radical as it is, trying out something new, then it's almost guaranteed to have some negative side effects. And Marxism and materialism and all of these things might just be part of that.
Yeah, Marxism is possibly just a result of Christianity plus wealth.
Well, it could be, but I don't think wealth alone produces Marxism out of Christianity. I think that you had to have the progressivism in there, because Marxism is not like Christianity is not necessarily progressive, right?
Right, yeah, it doesn't really have any concept at all of that. By progressivism, you mean the people who were caught up in the fact that life was getting better and better for everybody over time?
Yeah, and you have the Hegel, the thing going like God in society through this thesis, antithesis, evolving through time, going towards utopia, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Now, notice that what Marx did is that he took the Hegelian idealism and inverted it and turned it into Hegelian materialism.
Marx inverted Hegelian idealism into Hegelian materialism. Okay, yep. Yes, because Hegel was dealing with ideas and Marx said, well, actually it's social classes, but you've got it right.
Yep. This is not new to me, by the way. This is like a common explanation of what Marxism is and what he did with Hegel.
Yeah, or
so Hegel was an idealist, yeah. And I mean idealist in the philosophical sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, as Peikoff put it, I think Marx is Hegel in politics and economics.
Yes, but with the evil twin inversion, negation from idealism to materialism.
Right. Well, is it a negation or just an application? It's not an application.
It's a negation.
He's negating Hegel's idea?
Yeah, but then basically just getting Hegel's idea on its head.
A mirror image of it?
It's a mirror image. Because what you get if you take in idealism and you negate it, everything is just spirit. And what you get if you negate it?
Well, what do you have if you have Hegel? Are you saying Hegel is correct that one idea...
No, of course I'm not. He's an idealist, and I reject idealism. But what you get when you negate idealism is materialism. Those are mirror images of each other.
Yeah, they're the mind-body dichotomy.
So the idealists say that only the mind exists. The materialists say, no, only the body exists.
And they're both wrong.
Yeah. But notice that materialism is the negation of idealism.
Yeah, well, that's the D versus M.
Yeah, that's right. And so thesis, antithesis, that's actually a very good example of it, where you're negating something. But by negating it, you're actually just creating a mirror image of what you were trying to get away from.
Yeah.
So it contains most of the structure of what you are negating. That's what a mirror image does. A mirror image is different in only one sense. For instance, it inverts one axis or puts a minus sign, but in all other respects, it's the same image.
Yeah.
So Marxism comes out of Hegelianism, and Hegelianism is sort of, it can be thought of as a form of religious viewpoint, but it came as a direct negation again from the Enlightenment philosophy. It was so Hegel says, reason is not efficacious. Individual reason is not efficacious.
Right.
What is efficacious is this world spirit. So you have this world spirit that is thinking through the dialectic process of historical dialectism.
And that's where they get the idea of what you do as an individual doesn't matter. It's what the Führer does with all of society that really counts. And so any individual life just doesn't matter.
Yes. And notice how that is not an outgrowth of Christianity.
All right, yeah, fair enough. I'm thinking of Marxism being an outgrowth of Christianity, as in you should share the wealth with everybody, and then along comes a lot of wealth popping out of factories, and it boggles the mind of the guy, and he says, well, we got to share all this wealth. And it looks like just Christianity on a tricycle.
But on the other hand, you don't. That's not specific to Christianity. You find it in Judaism with the kibbutz thing, and you find it in all sorts of communitarian societies all over the world today. With tribalism, you have to give to the tribe. Like in Africa, for instance, it's a common thing that they say that there's holes in your pockets. That's how they describe it. If you have money, there's holes in your pockets. Like money will just disappear because there's always some family demanding it. So you're always pay for your family. You're never accumulating wealth because there's always some family member in need. So that's collectivism, tribalism. And you don't need Christianity for that.
All right. So you think that religion, we're stuck with religion more so than I'm hoping.
Oh yeah, I don't think we can get rid of religion anytime soon. So what I think is more reasonable is that we're doing our thing. We're slowly through natural selection trying to select and produce the best secular philosophy available. Hopefully weeding out the bugs along the way, like objectivists who refuse to self-reproduce, and all of these things. But along the way, while we're building up, like the Amish, step by step, we have to sort of accept that we're going to be living with religionists all around us, everywhere.
On all sides. We're surrounded, and we always will be.
So what I'm thinking of in the meantime as a survival strategy is that we make sort of very loose allies with those religionists who are the best, and we can teach them to become better, move them in the right direction. And those who are at the top of that list are Christians. I think that it's possible to do with other religions too, but especially Christians.
I like that you say at the top of that list, because as Ayn Rand said, your values should be in a hierarchy. You should always have the most important and then lesser important ones. And so the most important religious people should be fill in the blank, Christians or whoever.
I think those are the ones we are most closely aligned with. I like also parts of Buddhist thought. I mean, they do have elements of individualism in it, or egoism in it. So there are other thought systems that it's possible to align yourself with. I know many people who are part objectivist, part Buddhist, like they are in that intersection between those two. So that's fine. That's what I think is most realistic. That doesn't mean that we're now going to be promoting Christianity. That's not what I'm saying. So new intellectual can just breathe a sigh of relief. We should push our ideas, but we should, I think that we're going to make more headway, not by banging every religionist on the head. I think it's okay to give a compliment to Christians where they are doing a good job, and then we can bang them on the head where they're not doing a good job.
Well, yeah, I think it's also important where you said they should be our top priority to influence. So we're not necessarily, we're not going to convert them over to our ideas wholesale.
Some of them might.
Some of them maybe, but we're not looking to get every single church to lock, stock, and barrel start saying A is A. But it would be nice if they could appreciate, for example, that money's not the root of all evil, that reason is very important, etc. It would be nice if they could get some basic shit down. And that basic shit might be very important as the seeds to improve the culture over time. So instead of rejecting Christians, we should try to improve them.
So I like, for instance, the argument that the Christians can have their creator who endows us with various things like unalienable rights and so forth. That's fine. And one of the things he endowed us with was a brain and our capacity to reason. And that wasn't just for fun. It's because individual reasoning is a key part of what it means to be human. So I can see Christians being able to see that I can live with that. I can dig that. Like we put it within their framework of religion, but still very much push reason to the forefront of their way of dealing with the world. But we have to be careful then that not to intermingle reason with all sorts of sexual perversion and transgenderism and all this stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's Marxism. I'm afraid that comes from Marxism, not the Enlightenment.
Yeah, but as I say, Marxism has a very complicated relationship with Enlightenment. It grew out of the Enlightenment to some degree. So it's sort of like a bastard stepchild of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, fair enough. Or we could say it's a cancer.
A cancer is good.
And its identity is very, very tied up with the Enlightenment.
Yep.
The blood vessels that nurture it come from the Enlightenment.
Like, for instance, I just recently wrote an article on Liberty Nation on altruistic narcissism or narcissistic altruism. And I appeal to Christians in that. I say that Christians sort of, they are the ones who more or less invented conscience as a mental technology for self-improvement. And they are the masters of that. There are very few philosophical systems who have been able to hone that ability. But what I'm saying is that self-reflection can become a disease. And the myth of Narcissus is that he saw his own mirror image in a lake and he saw how beautiful he was. He fell in love. And when he realized that love couldn't be reciprocated, he killed himself. So it's a story, a warning of self-destructive self-reflection, and that conscience is a form of self-reflection. So if you look yourself in the mirror too much, looking for errors, you can start falling in love with the process of looking for guilt in yourself, and that turns into narcissistic altruism.
Very nice.
And one of the things that is special with that, you make yourself very easy to exploit. There are creatures out there that like to exploit them. And the way I use the vampire. We've talked about the vampire before. The vampire is a sociopath, and one of the key features of the vampire is that he can't see himself in the mirror. He has no mirror reflection, mirror image, right?
Right.
So imagine Narcissus and a vampire standing by the lake, looking into the lake. What do both of them see? They see Narcissus. So both of them see only, if you think of the mirror image as like a self-reflection of guilt, the sea of guilt, both of them see only Narcissus. So the vampire can only see faults in others. He doesn't self-reflect on his own errors. And Christians who have fallen prey to this form of narcissism, they can only see guilt in themselves too. So both of them agree that they are the guilty party. So therefore, the sociopaths out there, read progressives, they see conservatives as the source of all bad in society, and conservatives agree with that. They agree that they are the source of problems in their life because they're sinful creatures. So they look into themselves because they want to self-improve.
Yeah.
But this makes them easy for exploitation. So you have all these sociopaths, which we call progressives, that are stepchildren of Rousseau, who thought that we were born good, and therefore we don't have to self-reflect, right? So they are all the children of Rousseau are vampires. They don't have any mirror image, and therefore they can never self-improve. They can only try to improve others with their cancerous self.
Influence and take over others, but not improve.
Yes.
Not improve, though.
They can't improve themselves, so all they can do is they can spread their own cancer to others, believing it's improvement.
Yeah.
So my point here is, in this, I'm speaking directly to Christians, and I'm not trying here to say you should stop being Christian, but I want them to stop being altruistic narcissists, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so you can only improve yourself, and therefore, if you want to improve the world, you could improve yourself to the point where you're a billionaire, and that could really help the world.
Yep.
But if you just go around trying to improve other people, you're always going to be a stupid hippie.
That's right. So when you're self-reflecting, there are two ways of self-reflecting, of self-improving. One is to look for faults in yourself. Like, what did I do wrong that I can fix? And that's an incredibly empowering thing. Because if you tell a black person that you are poor because of racism, then he says, well, okay, that's someone else's fault and I can't really do anything about it. But if you tell him you are poor because you're being a douchebag, then he can improve that. He can stop being a douchebag. That's within his power. So it's very empowering for someone to be told that they have faults that they can improve. So that's actually very optimistic and positive to know that I am the one to blame. Because if I'm to blame, I can fix it, right? But the problem is that people fall in love with their own guilt. So you have to be able to balance this I'm to blame with no, not everything is my fault. Something is someone else's fault. And you have to be realistic about that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the thought crosses my mind of somebody born and raised in Soviet Russia who died in 1989 of old age, and you could not go to them and say, come on now, just, improve yourself, and you'll have a better life.
Yeah, and if you're born into an inner city, like a black person born to a single mother, everyone is born to single mothers in your neighborhood. You can't read and write. You can't do any basic maths because everyone tells you that science is white. That's for white people. Being good in school is for white people only. Then you can't really blame those people if they end up as like gang members who go around killing each other. It's hard. They have statistics not on their side. Of course, an empowering thing to say to them is that, okay, so you have experienced racism and you've been dealt a bad situation in life, but the only one who can fix that is you. And there are things you can do to improve. I remember when I was living in New York, I was living in Staten Island, and I always went down to the Staten Island ferry to go to work. And in the Staten Island ferry, especially at night, there were so many bums sleeping there. And one day, I met this guy, a quite well-dressed black guy. I met him outside of Staten Island Ferry, and he was cold, and he just wanted to chat and talk. Normally you're suspicious about that, but I talked to him, and he seems like a nice guy, and he was well-dressed. And he said he was cold. So, why don't you go into the Staten Island Ferry terminal? It's warm in there. And he said, I don't want to go in there because that's where all the bums go, and I don't want to be like a bum. So why are you going there like here? He's far away from home. He was just out walking far away from home. He didn't have a job. He had originally been in the military and had become a radio operator or something like that. And now he couldn't find a job from that. And I felt really sorry for the guy because he had done his part to get an education, and he didn't want to become a bum. So I could tell that this is a guy who really wanted to improve himself, but there wasn't just much opportunity for him to improve, which was a shame. So even if you have a good attitude, you can still end up not being able to escape your bad life. So that was sort of a sad story. But I think that for every person like that, most people, if you have that kind of attitude that you're not going to be a bum, you're going to succeed, you might end up being squashed by reality, but at least you have a chance of success. If you just give up and say that, screw the world, I'm screwed, I'm going to every life is against me, then you are going to fail for sure. So it's really important to give a positive message that you can make a difference in your own life, but also try to make it so that these people maximize the probability of succeeding. Now, this guy was very unlucky. He was living in New York, and New York is like a socialist hellhole with work regulations, blah, 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 all of these things, So it's not a very nice place if you want to do something with your life, if you're falling outside because of the regulations and the high taxes and all of that stuff. So New York is not the place for the American dream, unless you are very, very smart and willing to work very, very hard, blah, 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 all of these things. What I took home from that is that it is possible to fail even if you have the right attitude. And I felt this guy had the right attitude. And that was a sad story. But nevertheless, what we can do is we can try to build a society where people like that who want to get out of the ghetto actually had a chance to get out. to find work and so forth.
Yeah, America used to have a nice program where we gave land away for free or let people settle it, and if you lived there for 5 years, it was free. You had to pay for it if you didn't live there, and so and what's sad is that we still have a hell of a lot of land in the United States that the federal government owns. We ought to still be doing that, but they're holding on to it now. Same thing all around the world. Russia's got plenty of land. They could open it up to farmers, settlers, self-supporting people. And Australia, come on, they got land in Australia. I heard they have land down there. With the 1800s wasn't some sort of maniac period that can never happen again. It was the culture of the time.
Yep, it was the culture.
And we could do that again. It could be the future again.
Yeah, and are you the one that posted the maps of how many days it took to travel from New York?
I don't think so.
Okay, there was someone on Facebook who had this wonderful map. Like in 1810, it took this and this amount long time to go from New York to this and this place in the United States. So it took in the beginning, it took 8 weeks to get to California and stuff like that. And then as time progressed and you got roads, the traveling time reduced. And by the 1910, you can get to any place in 2 days or something like that, or 1 or 2 days in America.
Yeah.
Amazing. And the people who actually traveled to America from Europe, they were 8 weeks away from a better life. And when they get to that better life, they were not handed anything. They had to bring everything with them those 8 weeks and travel 8 weeks. And when they get there, they had to work for 3 years to build a farm. So their 8 weeks of travel and 3 weeks of farming are incredibly hard work just to survive.
Yeah.
But they did that.
Yeah, built a whole damn nation.
Yeah. And we can get there again. I have a feeling that when the space race starts, that's where we're going to see the next thing. People are going to skip the Australian desert and go directly to space.
I don't know, because space is so damn dangerous. That might not happen. And if that's the case, we might do the oceans or under the oceans. Just off the continental shelf, in the calm waters off of the beaches, we could have...
I hope that. The problem at the moment is that... I really like that Peter Thiel is talking about. 1 second, I just need to get some water. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Let's do a 5-minute break, because the audience would probably like that too.
All right, let's do that.
Okay. There was a little fireworks there today, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't there? Just a little bit. I mean, we were disagreement on life there, and I put that on the screen. We'll leave that as it was. Now then, as Darwin was growing up, Thomas Jefferson was an old man. And I say that because Jefferson was unable to conceive of any origin of life besides God. I was just telling them Thomas Jefferson couldn't conceive of any origin of life but God. And when he was dying as an old man, Charles Darwin was young. And so I posit premise one. Charles Darwin's theory is a turning point or a paradigm shift.
I agree.
Conclusion. God is dead.
No. That does not follow.
Too much, huh?
No, the thing is, this is a Marxist lie. Marx liked the idea, and he pushed that. And that's the only reason he pushed Darwinism, is to kill off religion. What? But when he realized that Darwinism was basically promoting conservative values and ideas, then he says, oh, no. We can't apply Darwinism to life. No, we don't like that. But we can apply it to killing God. Of course, that doesn't follow at all. I mean, just because things evolve doesn't mean that there's no creator. That's a logical fallacy. I'm not saying that it proves that there's a creator. That's not my point. But the point is that it doesn't follow from evolution that there is no God.
Yeah, Christopher Hitchens said there could be all kinds of gods. There could be a God who created us through evolution. He said there could be a God who created the universe and sits back and does nothing and is not interested in it. There could be a God who is creating all this as a cruel joke, and if you do the right things, you go to hell, and if you do the wrong things, you go to heaven, and he'll just laugh all the time.
Matrix, yeah.
So there's all kinds of possibilities, including...
Absolutely.
Now, of course, we could rule out God in other ways, but just the point that evolution occurs isn't a disproof of God, and that was Marx's line.
Yeah, indeed. And that was the only reason he liked evolution, because he hated absolutely everything else about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the conclusions that it really actually leads to are conservative conclusions.
Yes, have children, take care of, conservative values, like not avoid single motherhood, blah, blah, blah. The father is important, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. So, all right. Now, what were we on before we broke? Before we took a break?
Peter Thiel. He has talked about how development has stopped, like innovation has stopped.
Yeah. No, you
like
said 1910 we could get anywhere in 2 hours, and I was about to say, isn't that pretty much, or 2 days? And I was about to say, isn't that almost what it is today? So it hasn't changed much in 100 years.
That's right. And actually, he dates it back to the end of the 60s, when the rocket science was finished, right? After we landed on the moon, nothing has happened.
Yeah. Yeah, he said if you take the electronic gadgets out of a room, it's identical to a 1970s room.
Yep. The thing that's happened since the 1970s is that the productivity has gone down in healthcare and in schools, right? So healthcare and school has become more expensive. And we have some cheap labor, some slaves in China producing cheap stuff for us that covers up that fact. But if we didn't have cheap slave labor in China, then we would be poorer than we were in 1970 if we ignore the the electronics part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, very sad fact of the grinding to a halt.
Airbnb and Uber are signs of poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sharing, if you have to share stuff, it means that you can't afford to not share.
Yeah. And in the 1960s, nobody would have thought of calling a car and waiting for 30 minutes for the car to get there to pick them up. They'd just go buy their own damn car, because if you had a job, you had the money for a car.
That's right.
Any job, you could afford a new car if you... they weren't that expensive relative to wages at that time. Of course, they were much worse than the cars we get today. They only went 50,000 miles before they were busted all to hell, but still.
So what I'm going to propose is the following, that after World War II, there was a period of like massive industrialization all over the world, and in Europe and in America in particular. And what happened, the new global world order that was built up then led to a period of prosperity and peace. Enormous industrialization of America and of Europe and of Japan and so forth. And what came in that wake was the prosperity that was built up was largely stolen and leached by the deep states.
And what have they done with? What do you propose they've done with it?
Build up a bureaucracy, red tape. They've used the power to finance the deep state.
You know, it's accelerating exponentially.
Yes.
It's getting
so they've
so
stolen all that wealth. The reason people are not richer now than in 1970, roughly speaking, is because all that extra productivity and wealth has been stolen by bureaucrats and politicians who are using it to build up regulation agencies and red tape.
And to live easy lives much better than the rest of us without working hard at all. Just by going to stupid offices and sitting through stupid meetings, they make $100,000 a year.
Yeah, but that's not if that was the only cost of the deep state, that we had to pay a lot of leeches $100,000 a year for just sitting there, that's no problem. That's almost nothing.
Well, the problem is they grow, they multiply by 2 every year.
Yeah, but their salaries are not the problem. The problem is that they are destroying things. They're destroyers.
Yeah.
They regulate things.
Yeah.
They prevent people from being productive.
Yeah.
So every one of those person who goes to job, if they were just sitting in an office not doing anything, not creating any regulations, that wouldn't cause any problems. It would be just a tiny minor problem, economic drain.
So
but what they're doing is that they're destroying productivity on a massive scale.
So to make an analogy with cancer and biology, the one example would be just a little lump that it's sure your blood vessels are feeding it, but it's just sitting there, a benign tumor, a mole or something.
Yep.
And another example would be the cancer which keeps growing and it's taking over part of your heart, or it's constricting your liver or something like this.
And just destroying your productive capabilities in your body.
And the deep state is more akin to a cancer than a nuisance.
Yep. It's a cancer.
What are we going to do about it? So it can't be stable in the long run, as we were earlier positive.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to fix that. We will just have to see what happens. I'm fighting on the way. But my point is this. Imagine all that wealth that has been stolen and destroyed through regulation. All that could have been used for going to space, doing all sorts of really cool innovations everywhere.
Every once in a while, I have a fantasy about India looking like, every place in India looking like Hong Kong. You know, I mean, it really should have. They have the British Empire's respect for law. And so they're just missing several ingredients, but it should be the Hong Kong of the East, because they have respect for rights, more so than communist China anyway. So I have fantasies about that, but all that wealth could have been made to turn Russia into a Hong Kong, to turn Eastern Europe into a Hong Kong, to turn Africa and South America into versions of Hong Kong. So,
indeed.
And South Korea and Japan. Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan could have been printed all over the world with the wealth that we've destroyed and constricted through bureaucratic nonsense, such as the Soviets.
Yeah, so I was now first and foremost only talking about what the deep states have done in Europe and America.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they've managed to do a lot of damage there. But what you're talking about is that, like, if we could have included the whole world into this creative process of capitalism, there's just no end to what we could have achieved.
Yeah.
But I guess that is like a little bit of like a utopian dream, saying that then a miracle occurs, then socialists are just all of a sudden going to be nice people.
Well,
that's a fairy tale.
The UN set some goal to get poverty below 20% by 2010, and in 2009 it was down to 12%. The free economy smashed their goals all to pieces, and they were left standing there wondering what had happened.
Yeah,
poverty.
That's globalization. I don't want to say globalism because that's different. That's an ideology. But globalization and spreading of markets all across the world is basically to take credit for that, or to blame, if you like. So it's even though like China has all these unhealthy work conditions and almost near slavery conditions for a lot of people, it is true that hundreds and hundreds of millions of Chinese have been uplifted from poverty.
Yeah.
The average salary in China now is, I think, up to something like $6,000 per year, something like that.
Yeah, it's getting so high. I heard something about wages. It said an American would require $15 an hour for this job, but in China, people will do it for $6 an hour. And I thought, $6 an hour? Jesus, we used to be paying them $6 a week.
That's right.
In my lifetime, I remember when it was like
I remember that too.
A
It's
Chinese
crazy.
man earns $1.10 a day, or 10 cents an hour for a 12-hour workday. You know,
Yep.
that was recent.
Yep. It's not more than like 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
So you say, and then a miracle happened, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that's quite a miracle. And
Yeah, so this has happened despite the deep state.
Yeah.
Right?
But
the point is that this is like the powerful siphoning off that massive profit. So it's a consolidation of power. So while we are being surging upwards, no one is thinking about something bad going on. So everyone is just celebrating that everything is improving. And they just don't see that there's this massive growth of bureaucracy, and a lot of people just putting their little straws into people's lives, sucking the life force out of them. So it's like putting a drag on the whole system. So even though it was rising, it's slowing down. And at around 1970, it ground to a halt, right? So nothing has happened since 1970 apart from within electronics.
Because they were not regulated.
That's right. And it's specifically one area that has had this massive improvement is the semiconductor and computer. So they've been able to do this shrinking of this lithography kind of technique. And it's basically just one industry, and it's basically just one or two or three companies like Intel, AMD, and a few others that have been, and IBM, that have been doing research on this.
No.
And those few companies, it's just a tiny handful of people, are behind all the innovation in the world since 1970. And because of them, we have cheap computers.
A very small number, vanishingly small number of people are responsible for this.
Yeah, but like a building, like the World Trade Center was the last skyscraper built in America in 1973.
Yeah, now
72.
Sometimes I wonder about this this idea of progress, because I look back, I think the horse and cart was invented at some point, and then that's what was used up until the automobile. You know, there wasn't progress. They invented different types of axles or whatever and made axles better. What if it's like a plateau? What if we went up a steep curve, but now we're on a plateau? I mean,
That's possible too.
What really is the next step besides an automobile? A safer, faster automobile?
Flying cars.
Well, I mean, but how practical is that? Those are so damn dangerous. Helicopters and planes.
No. I guarantee you, if there had been a wash in money for that kind of project, we would have been so far ahead when it comes to flying cars and something like that.
Yeah. I wonder. I mean, aviation quality machinery is so expensive. I wonder. I think it might be like the horse and cart thing. I think we might spend 1,000 years driving automobiles to and fro. And
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say, think of all the traffic in the air, but there'd be less traffic than there is on the ground, wouldn't there? Because there's so much more space and directions to move things in. I'm not doubting the practicality of it. I'm doubting our ability to withstand the expense and our desire, I think, to withstand the expense. What's the utility? Would it really bring increased utility? Because that's what would cause us to adopt it, right? Is if it was more useful and efficient. So I guess I would cast doubt on that.
The thing is, why do people flock to cities, right?
To be around other people. To be around other people with goods and services that other people provide.
Yeah. So why can't they live far away from cities and do that?
They do nowadays. They live 30 minutes away or 40 minutes away.
In a car, yeah. Why can't they live like 200 miles away?
Yeah, and the rich people do, and they go on private jets to local airports, and
yeah. So basically, flying cars, something equivalent to that. I've been working on this for a long time. I've been looking into a lot of these technologies. There's so many technological innovations that could have been done, and I've been thinking a lot about many of them. And they're just right there, waiting to happen, but there's no money put into it because of taxes and regulations and blah 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 blah. So no innovation occurs.
I want to mention Alaska, where if you don't have an airplane, then you don't live in Alaska.
That's right. So that's an example where you have a regulation-free zone. So it's because of airplanes, you can actually live in Alaska.
Yeah, and a depressingly large number of them are Piper Cubs from the 50s. It's amazing how many very, very old airplanes they refurbish and fly constantly. They're just rebuilt and refurbished and rebuilt and refurbished. And maybe it's because we haven't built better ones, or maybe it's because we don't need to, because we have those. But Alaska is an example of what you would have where you could live and support your life and get along. But how many people? Patsy Cline died in it. John Denver died in a plane crash. Small planes are dangerous.
That's not an argument because, cars were also dangerous once upon a time. Then we fixed that.
Small planes are dangerous because they fly down inside the weather. Jumbo jets are safe because they fly in the upper atmosphere.
There are lots of ways. And what you're basically saying here is there's no solution to that. I don't believe that.
There's no solution to car crashes. No,
but you can minimize that, right? You can make things safer.
What you're saying is true, and Alaska proves it. I'm just saying that maybe, Alaska proves my side too, because the usefulness of airplanes in Alaska is enormous. The usefulness of an airplane in New York City is very, very, very much less useful. It'll get you down to Roanoke, Virginia in 2 or 3 hours, or 5 hours, whatever, 4 hours. But what's in Roanoke that's not in Delaware or Connecticut? What, a golf course or something? So there's limited utility to it, which is probably the reason that we haven't all gone the Alaska route. We don't want to.
I can guarantee you, if there had been a very, very cheap aviation available, then you would have seen lots of new things. I can guarantee you 100%.
I promise you, if aviation were cheap, I would fly.
Yeah.
I would fly just to fly in the afternoon and go take a look at stuff.
That's right. And consider the following scenario. Suppose that you build a seasteading off the coast of New York or wherever, somewhere there. And you're 200 miles off the coast or 100 miles off the coast. How would you get in? You can fly in, right?
Yeah, and that's
So-
boat. Boats are slow.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways of getting around that. So I've been looking into this infrastructure problem of transportation. There's just so many opportunities waiting there to happen, but it's being stopped all the way, all the time. And transportation really puts a limit on what kind of society you can have. If you can have a way of transporting yourself very, very quickly, safely, and cheaply, then you can live, let's say, 200 miles outside of a city, and you can get, and if you can travel 400 miles an hour, then you can get into the city in half an hour, right?
Yeah.
And avoid all traffic.
Yeah, I once had an idea of large freeways, utterly straight and smooth, built up on stilts or something above everything, like freeways, but super freeways, and very obsessively straight and smooth so that the maximum mile per hour could be safely 100 or 120, and not allow cars that weren't up to standard to even enter the freeway. And
that's called Germany.
Yeah. Oh, really? Do they have a restriction on the automobiles that can enter it?
Well, yeah. There are certain. Like,
I mean, you can't have a moped or whatever.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So you have certain restrictions.
Yeah.
But the Autobahn, you can basically drive 150 miles per hour.
Yeah. Yeah. True. And so I had thought of
and
this.
I have done that, actually.
I had thought of this because the geography in Utah is such that Salt Lake City is outgrowing the valley it lives in, and it's very difficult to get out of that valley. You have to go through these small mountain roads up through the Wasatch Mountains or out to this desert out in the west, and there's a mountain range between you and the desert, and I wanted to put a freeway right through the mountain range on the west side of Salt Lake, going out into this valley out there, which is utterly empty, and 50 miles long, and 40 miles wide, and full of empty sagebrush and ranches. And then you could even have the damn freeway moving, and when the cars get on it, they're moving on a moving freeway, like when you get on the walkway at the airport.
And what you're describing now, basically, is something that you could do if you have increased productivity. But because all productivity improvement has ground to a halt in the recent 50 years, nothing new has happened in 50 years on that technology side.
Yeah.
There's no improvement to these things. So there are lots of things that are easily, it's not, there would be a lot of demand for things. Like once you have the iPhone, no one knew that they wanted an iPhone until they saw one. So if it's cheap and it's available, people will buy it. It's not a problem. The problem, it's not cheap and it's not available because of lack of improvement to productivity.
Yeah.
And the chief reason for that is because all the money is going into feeding pet projects of evil bureaucrats and politicians.
Oh, it gets so bad. Do you know they built these fucking expensive buildings? I can't remember where. It's the news story recently. They built these expensive buildings in California, and now there's a risk that the buildings are cracking. They found some cracks in some of the concrete things, steel. There's structural steel that's cracking, and they said to fix it, it'll cost $380 million. Right? So they built these bloated, expensive buildings to begin with, and then now they're going to charge the state gargantuan sums to fix them. It's amazing. They should be bonded against something like that. You know, you should have to take out a bond in case your project fails, and the insurance company will bail the situation out. But of course, in a government boondoggle, it was probably all planned. I'll bet it was all planned.
I don't know. I'm not going to make any claims on things, but what I can say for sure is that if it hadn't been for these cancerous deep state people who suck the life force out of people, we would have a booming economy. We would literally be going to the moon. Like we would be like on vacation on the moon right now, kind of thing.
If Africa and South America and India all looked like Hong Kong,
No, even if you didn't do anything, if just America had stopped growing towards communism, which it has done since after World War II, when the communists started infiltrating America, right?
yeah.
So communism has partially succeeded. The Soviet Union failed, but now they've moved over to America.
Well, communism is a disease that infected and killed Russia, and its bloating pus has sprayed all over the world.
That's right, and including in America.
Yeah, and it's infected us for sure.
And so I think that that's a disease that you can't really get rid of, if you know what I mean. It's like it's a human condition. There's always going to be an evil communist.
Yeah.
Always going to be a snake in the garden.
And especially if we view communism as just the people who want to get together in a group and not respect individuals. Like, that can wear many, many different hats.
Indeed, and that's not going to go away anytime soon, and we have to be on the outlook for that all the time. So I'm really annoyed by the fact that we could have had such technological development, but it's just grinding to a halt. And now, because people are growing tired of materialism, they think they're growing tired of capitalism and technology and development. So they are becoming traditionalists, right?
Yeah.
So this means, and traditionalists, they think means that they have to then go back to church. They have to start going in like the Amish people, getting away from technology, all of these things.
Yeah, I want to tell these people that nuclear technology with nuclear material, uranium and stuff, is dangerous. But the cure for it is not to go back to the 1800s. It's to learn to live with what we have created. You cannot rewind the tape. The tape is being shredded as we play it, so you can't rewind, guys. You can't go back. The churches that you want to go back to are gone. They were in your parents' minds. I'm afraid that even if they want to preserve religion, I'm afraid religion's broken. It's got a flat tire now.
Never, ever underestimate religion. It will reemerge somehow. Just look at the environmental movement. That may be how it's going to recreate itself. That everyone becomes like a vegetarian and sacrifices to the plastic god or something like that.
Yeah, or it's cultism. And if we can draw it that widely, then Russia was a religion and communism was a religion. So
it's a religious impulse, definitely. And so what I'm saying is that without a compass, you're going to go in circles.
We'll always fight collectivism, but the God flavor might not be very important from here on out.
But the thing is, whatever it depends on your definition of God, right? I'm just saying that the plastic God.
All right,
it's a god.
So my point is pretty flaccid. I'm just saying the Bible is not important, and you're saying, oh, so what? They're gonna worship something else.
They're gonna reinvent something to worship.
They'll have a new god.
Yep.
That's a bumper sticker. They will have a new god.
And that's why I'm saying that I'm not so unhappy about keeping Christianity alive, because at least we know what we have, and it's doing something that's not too awful compared to a lot of other things.
I just have a vision of the weekend at Bernie's.
Did I lose you?
I don't know. I still have you. But religion may be Bernie at the weekend at Bernie's. I don't know if you can hear me.
Did I lose connection, Howard?
I can still hear you.
Did I lose connection here?
It's unfortunate. I don't think he can see my camera either. So, well,
okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, but I can't see you, but I haven't been able to see you all this time, so...
Oh, well, what was the question about then? Why did you thought you had lost connection?
Because the sound disappeared for a while, then you came back.
Oh, it must have been glitches once in a while. Interesting. Well, where are we? What should we? Did we have something we didn't cover? Or are we?
I think we've covered a lot now. The only thing I want to talk about, ending on a positive note, like we can't just talk about how awful things are. I want to think a little bit about the future. I'm firmly convinced that a lot of what we can do is not just like talk about how bad things are, and not just talk about like how great Ayn Rand is. I mean, Ayn Rand is great. Don't get me wrong. But what I mean is like this idea of just, clean your room kind of thing, but taking it to the next level, meaning trying to find a way to carve out a space of freedom in the world and move technology forward so that we can make it easier in the future to have the kind of freedom that we want. So I'm very pro-technological development. I think that technology has it's like the Gutenberg thing with like Protestantism with Martin Luther would never have happened without the printing press. So Gutenberg's invention actually created a revolution in free speech, right?
Yeah.
And the internet similarly created a second Gutenberg revolution with YouTube and all of these things. We're using precisely that technology right now. So technology can be a liberating force if you can use it right. So one way of doing it is to think that while we're pushing freedom in just like in the idea space, pushing technology that can help us, assist us along the way, and maybe even make money along the way, that's a really great thing.
Well, two thoughts. So Gutenberg invents books, and then Immanuel Kant prints books. So that's worrying. And so we can spread evil ideas pretty easily now. And Gutenberg invents his press, and now there's a Bible in every nightstand in every hotel room in America. So if you're worried about people reading the Bible, then that's not good.
I can guarantee you that people are today that are Christians are infinitely more rational than the people who didn't know how to read and write.
Well, maybe Kant was a better example of that then. So Gutenberg invents the printing press, but now we have Kant. And
that's true. Like there's always a snake in the garden or a Kant.
Yeah,
right.
And
so technology isn't always for good. So we have to watch out for that. That's true.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can use technology for the better. Like, would you choose a world with or without the internet? Which one do you benefit most from?
Oh, definitely with, and the fax machine similarly, which communism was frightened of. And I want the printing press. Even though Immanuel Kant can publish his books, I want to be able to publish mine. So
why do you think that the left is so afraid of free speech? It's because they have a losing argument, right?
Yeah. So would you say we're just widening the war? So the internet just widened the war, and what they want to do is restrict freedoms to restrict the war, so that it's easier for them to win. And we're saying, open it up. Let's have a bigger war.
So, for instance, let me be concrete about it. If we were able to somehow be able to find a material technology making it cheaper to make material things, let's think of like some who are along the line of like 3D printing large scale. Then maybe people could start making like these seasteading modules that you can just 3D print, so to speak, and it would be cheap to make things. Floating cities on the ocean, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to move there to live out on the ocean. But if it exists, if a floating free city exists, then I'm just using the seasteading as an example now. But if the technology enables that, then all of a sudden people on the land have to start to compete with those floating free cities. And this forces people on land to become freer.
Just like America has forced people all around the world to become freer.
Yep.
Through
that's
hook,
right.
through hook, nook, and crook. We do it lots of ways. Sometimes we invade their country and take them over, like Japan and Germany. But sometimes we just sue them in court and we say, all of the assets of your politicians are frozen until you enact these laws about protecting American trademarks.
But not only that, but like, I mean, China saw Hong Kong and they saw, okay, we have to do that in order to be competitive, right?
Yeah. Shenzhen was right next door to Hong Kong.
That's right. So by simply having a better solution, people have to copy you.
Yeah, that's true. And Soviet Russia had no option. They had to adopt the things we did.
That's right. And so what I'm saying is that there's a kind of positive message there in that if we can find a way to improve technology so that it'll be cheaper to make solutions that promote freedom, then that is actually going to be good in the long run also politically.
Even for people in other countries.
Yes, and everywhere.
Yeah, cross-border, globally. That's globalism.
That's great.
We come full circle to being globalists.
Oh my goodness. So that's sort of like a positive message to end on, more or less, I think.
All right, very good. Yeah, we're past 2 hours, so we exhaust our audience at some point. So we're almost
3 hours, actually.
Yeah, very good. All right. Well, thank you for the chat, Onar. We will put it out to the world and see what happens.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. If you like the stuff that I do, please go to Patreon. Throw me a few bucks a month. I heard Trollface is thinking of starting a thing. And, Existence University's out there. He's got a Patreon up. So if you support your objectivists, then support your objectivists.